But at this point, I'd like to hand over. I'm not sure which of the two of you wants to start talking and the other listening. Graham's going to kick off. So we'll kick off with yourself, Graham, and then we'll come to Padraig, and then hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have some talking and listening a little bit later on. Graham Spencer, Padraig O'Malley, great to have the two of you with us. Great.
Thank you, John. Marvellous talks this afternoon, very enjoyable. Thank you, everybody. The idea of this session is really to keep it as conversational as possible. So I want to offer some observations which have evolved from, as John mentioned, working in Northern Ireland, interviewing in Northern Ireland and researching in Northern Ireland. And then we're going to kind of talk a bit more about the value of the interview process as well as part of not just academic understanding, but possible influence in peace process. And Padraig is much more experienced in that area than me, and we'll talk about that. One of the things that immediately arises is, for me, with regards to Northern Ireland, is in interviewing people, not only what they were listening to or thought they were listening to, but what they were listening for and how they were interpreting what they were listening. So I just want to offer a couple of examples to point out differences and potential problems around two sides that hear different things and listen differently. After the conclusion of the Hillsborough Agreement on the devolution of policing and justice in 2010, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Irish Taoiseach Brian Cowan addressed the press. Brown said, "We've got the detail of the agreement right," and Cowan said, "We have got the spirit of the agreement right." A Scots Presbyterian, son of a Presbyterian minister, Brown, preferred to focus on the agreement in terms of precision, exactness, possibly the irrefutable. Cowan, on the other hand, Irish Catholic, emphasised the agreement in terms of approximation, space and the fluid. You could say that the emphasis on detail, important though it is, also brings with it a certain expectation of limitation, while spirit points perhaps more to possibility and expansiveness. This difference in outlook, for me, could be observed amongst the sides involved in the peace process, particularly in terms of how each appreciated or did not appreciate what the other was trying to say. And to kind of illustrate the differences that were flagged up there by that example with Brown and Cowan, David Trimble in 1998, after the Good Friday Agreement was agreed, said that it had effectively copper fastened the Union, while for nationalists and later Republicans, the agreement was a stepping stone for progress. So whilst Trimble possibly read the agreement as minimising change, for nationalists and Republicans, it was about using the agreement to maximise change. So given these approaches, how is listening being used and applied? Indeed, is there any possibility of an agreed moral reasoning or understanding when one looks at the history of the conflict from the perspective of maybe, say, a literal understanding compared to what you might call a metaphorical understanding? One of the senior British officials, who John would know, referred largely to these two differences as, on the Unionist loyalist side, a static analysis, compared to, on the Nationalist and Republican side, a dynamic analysis. Now, I understand there are always problems with generalising in this way, but stay with it, because I think there's certainly some validity in this. So you could say that while the static analysis is reactive, the dynamic analysis is proactive. While the static analysis is undramatic and regressive, the dynamic analysis is dramatic and progressive. And while the static analysis tends to see change in terms of loss, for the dynamic, change is seen as a gain. Compromise is disadvantageous for the static analysis, advantageous to the dynamic analysis. And we could go kind of on and on with those sort of polarizations. But there is a certain difference, and John would understand this, and I look forward to John's comments on this, about the way language is used by the two sides, which fascinates me in terms of how they understand what peace is and what the expectations of peace amount to. Certainly, one of the most divisive words, it seems to me, used in Northern Ireland still now is community, which is not, as one would think, perhaps an inclusive emphasis, but the opposite, a division emphasis, an emphasis on where certain people are inside and certain people are outside. And there's nothing that's that kind of new or interesting about that. But there's very little, if any, conversation about society as a whole, thinking in terms of the collective or the common good, around notions of social exclusion, diversity, and transgenerational trauma. All these issues have now been absorbed into political narratives and become an extension of those narratives for good and bad. Now, perhaps a more conversational approach to these things creates a more open-ended framework within which to discuss these possibilities. Looking at Catherine Mannix's new book called Listen, just come out, she describes conversation as a dance, led at one point by one of the kind of participants before then relinquishing it to the other. And this ensures fluidity and avoids competition. Part of that we can see in the interview process, which Padraig might want to talk about. So leaving aside that wider political context, what are the possibilities that occur from listening in a personal way? In 2007, I interviewed IRA bomber Patrick Mcgee, who was caught and given multiple life sentences because of his part in the Brighton bomb, which exploded at the Grand Hotel at the Conservative Party conference in 1984. The bomb killed 5 people and injured 31. Under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, Mcgee was released. One of the people who Mcgee was responsible for killing, along with 2 others who have never been caught, was Sir Anthony Berry. At the time of his release from jail, Mcgee was contacted by Jo Berry, the daughter of Anthony Berry, and asked to meet Mcgee. He agreed, although he expected the meeting to be volatile and over very, very quickly. The comment he used to me from that meeting was, quote, "She disarmed me by listening." The idea that listening can become a form of persuasion, whether it's intended or not, fascinated me. But Berry and Mcgee have since formed a collaboration where they go around the world talking about not just the motivations of violence, but the impact of violence on victims and so on. To me, that personal example suggests a kind of as close to reconciliation as one might get, and should be perhaps used as a model for thinking about legacy, but of course is not really featured in those discussions. The legacy process is already being kind of conceptualized, it seems to me, in terms of blame and responsibility and how that's going to be handled. The underlying sectarianism will not be addressed. On the point of language, unionists tend to steer clear of words like equality and reconciliation because they believe those words to be Republican terms. And Republicans have said to me they often don't like the word truth when it's used by unionists because such words tend to be used against them, loaded again with responsibility and blame. Now, we know there are 4 or 5 different concepts of truth used in the South African peace and reconciliation, truth and reconciliation process. But without sustained work on addressing underlying sectarianism, the stress on communities rather than society, certainly in this instance, I think has kept the basis for trouble alive rather than diluted it or diffused it. Bertie Ahern, Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, who was involved in the peace process and of course led the Irish government to the agreement of 98, said to me in an interview that 90% of his business was done informally, quietly on a one-to-one basis, i.e. conversationally. The value of the conversation, again, is stressed in Catherine Mannix's new book on Listen, a conversation where she says should be designed not to try to fix problems, but enabling participants to become architects of their own solution through listening and talking. She describes this as tender conversations. She talks about trying to suspend the use or the imposition of different values by inviting rather than forcing conversation. Bertie Ahern spoke about how participants were much more likely to reveal their worries, fears, and anxieties in the one-to-one interaction, and how he said it's essential to understand what those worries, fears, and anxieties were if agreement were to be reached. The problem, however, it seems to me, is the question of what happens after agreements when new worries, fears, and anxieties emerge, and how without ongoing conversation, we end up with a situation as we do now, i.e. the tensions and threats of violence over the protocol in Northern Ireland. Fears, anxieties, loathings, sectarianism, all too easily coming to the surface and opening divisions. So I would argue that the context for listening is as important as the conversation itself. And on the point of listening, one of the things that I want Padraig to talk about is what goes on in the interview process, where we as academics are trying to understand what these people were thinking about when they embarked on this process, and what the differences are, and indeed what the differences still are. So I would ask Padraig to say a few words about his experience of conducting interviews and the value of the interviews, not just academically, but in terms of what it can lead to regarding understanding about ending conflict.
Thank you, Graham. And good afternoon, everybody. And I'd remind you again that the proceedings of last year's conference will be published this November. And if possible, I'd like to publish the proceedings of this year's conference next spring. So I'll be writing to each of you and asking whether you can flush out your presentations into a fully fledged articles. And I must say it's good to see so familiar faces. And thank you, John, as always, for arranging this. Let me just add a couple of sentences first to what Graham said. You know, in one sense, the Irish process struck me as one where that was accompanied by a minimum of listening. George Mitchell talks about the 2 years he spent having to bear the parties in the forum that was supposedly discussing peace shout and scream at each other and say the same thing day after day after day. At the end of which he laid down as a marker, things had to be completed by the Good Friday of the following year, or he was going home. But when you read two accounts of that, one by Jonathan Powell, and the other notes that were taken by Tony Blair's chief aide who accompanied him and who kept a running diary of the last days of the negotiations when Blair was in Belfast. What comes across is, number one, Powell talks about having to interpret what Republicans said to what Unionists said, that their use of the language was so different that the Unionists and Protestants simply couldn't understand what Republicans were saying. For Protestants and Unionists, it was my yea is my yea, my nay is my nay, directness all the time. And for on the Gaelic Catholic culture side, it's be as indirect as you can and convey as much as you can in ambiguity, that it's subject to multiple interpretations and lots of florid language. And the other thing that Holmes talked about is the complete breakdown of negotiations between the Irish government and Unionists in Strand 2, where things got so bad that the British government had to get between both of them and essentially had to mediate their differences until the end of the negotiations. And in Jonathan Powell's books, he uses a line that when it was finished, some of the participants didn't even know what they had agreed. They'd been pushed and pulled over the finishing line, and this was partly because that allowed Trimble to stand up at the signing ceremony and say that the union was secure forever, and for Sinn Féin to say the union was never so insecure. And that bifurcation continues to exist today, so that the the fault and how the agreement was reached, which was amended 5 times in the next 14 years, the consequences of that still live today, and the main differences between the two parties continue to exist. But let me address something else. That is, I've been interviewing people of every suasion for the last 50 years. That includes Nelson Mandela, Benazir Bhutto, the families of the Irish hunger strikers, black families in townships, Chris Patton, the Chancellor of Oxford, and of course John Allardyce himself. I've been interviewing John, I think, since the mid-1980s. What I use listening for in an interview is to have a conversation and establish a relationship. So a good interview for me is not necessarily one where I get all the questions that I wanted answered. It's one where I've been able to open the door to a follow-up interview and to begin the process of establishing a personal relationship. And once I've established those relationships, I'm then able to use, or have been able to use, the coterie of people involved to bring them together with other people they don't necessarily want to talk to. A good example of this might have been in 1997, when Nelson Mandela invited all the leading parties in South Africa to come to South Africa to learn about the South African experience. That was preceded by 3 years of interviewing, including all the key players in South Africa. That I conducted over 1,000 interviews between 1989 and 2007 with every key player in South Africa, interviewing them year after year after year. So, and all of those interviews are hosted by the Mandela Organization. So when I conduct an interview, I lock eyes with the person I'm interviewing. And I never take my eyes off his or her eyes. I never consult a note. I just let my body and his or her body, the cues that we get for each other, dictate the pace of the conversation and the direction it will take. So if it's a good conversation, it's one in which the interviewee will start to open up, particularly if they can see that in my face, if they're reading my face and looking at me, and they are, because I'm looking directly into their eyes, if they see that I am mirroring their reactions, that I'm empathetic. So what I call this is empathetic listening, the function of which is to establish a relationship. I allow my follow-up questions to proceed directly from the conversation as it is, not from a list of questions I have. Now, this may mean that I come out of the interview, as I said, with maybe half of the questions I wanted answered addressed. But the point I'd emphasize is that I would get a second interview. Using this kind of technique, I got to interview Cyril Ramaphosa during the negotiations in South Africa, and Rolf Meyer, his counterpart on the national side, 10 times while the actual negotiations were actually going on, because we had developed a relationship where they felt free to convey to me the internal problems of the negotiations as they proceeded, because they had learned to trust me. And one fallout of that was that without much authority, I invited both of them. This is in the middle of negotiations. I invited both of them to come to my university to be our commencement speakers in 1993. And both Mandela and F.W. de Klerk signed off on that, and Ramaphosa and Meyer came to Boston, where they had 4 days together, away from anybody whispering in their ear or trying to dictate things. That was beneficial to both of them and cemented the relationship they had. The differences between doing Zoom, this has fascinated me, and Zoom interviews and in-person interviews. In the last year, I have conducted over 100 Zoom interviews for a book I'm writing on the perils and prospects of the United Ireland. Now, as a backdrop, I had completed 20 interviews in Belfast before the COVID crisis caused me to return to the United States. In-person interviews, you will be told the person may run late. They're invariably on the phone when you get there or talking to somebody else. You're told you have about 40 minutes at most. 35 minutes into the interview, there'll be a knock on the door and somebody will say your time's almost up. And you scrape and scrawl to get to 40 minutes in. In the Zoom interview, everybody turned up on time. There were no cancellations. Everybody spoke for at least an hour. In fact, I found myself having to terminate the interviews. And one of the main differences was that people, when they're talking to a screen, tend to be speaking at something rather than to somebody. And as long as they see themselves on the screen, they feel compelled to need to keep talking, which means that to some rather simple questions, they will go on at length, and you, the interviewer, are not exactly in a position to interrupt other than banging the screen and saying it's time to move on. Whereas if you're doing it in person, your bodily cues and slight movement of hands can move you easily from one question to another. The second is content, that the in-person interviews are fuller of real content. Whereas again, the Zoom interviews are overloaded with words. But when you look at the transcript and read it through, you'll find that there's much less substance involved. So this kind of, in a way, has posed a problem with regarding to the scale of the content. But what fascinated me in the end was the fact that so few, even though they were very busy people, would actually terminate the interview themselves. It was as though they would continue talking as long as they had a screen available to them. So just to wrap up, I'll go back and summarize the point I was making, is that I see interviews as a form of empathetic listening, establishing a relationship, and then being able to use those relationships to bring people together who don't necessarily want to get together, or for having them participate in projects that may be outside their immediate realm of competence, but certainly where they have a major contribution to make. For example, I took John Alderdice to Helsinki and then to CRIC, where he was a participant in two different forums with the leaders of Iraq and CRIC, where his contribution was very significant. So in order we can open it up for some conversation, I'll hold it there. And thank you for listening.
The way you've spoken about this matter of listening Now, I know that one of the reasons for the two of you being both prepared and presenting quite concisely is because you want to have some input from some of the other colleagues in the room and on the call. And I don't want to delay that, but I just have to make one or two brief comments. The first is on this question of listening and how important it is. I remember with some colleagues, and I think Rich may have been there along with Scott, where we went to visit with a man who had set up a kibbutz many years ago. And I remember we sat in the sun and we asked him to talk about his situation. And after about an hour and a half of listening to him, he said, "You haven't told me what I have to do." And I said, "Well, I have no idea what you have to do. I'm here to just to listen and try to learn." He said, "Nobody ever comes here without telling us what we have to do." And I said, "Well, I have no idea what you have to do." And he said, "You're a psychiatrist, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, that's probably why you're listening. But you know something? I don't care. At least you're listening." And I think that's a really important thing. Both of you have taken a great deal of time to listen to people. And because you have actively listened, and you've described that process of active listening, which, as you quite clearly said, is not about having a list of questions that you want answered, but is actually about establishing a relationship with the other person and engaging with them. I think that's really important. The second is something else that you talked about, Graham, which you described the differences of approach, broadly speaking, between unionists and nationalists, people from Protestant and Catholic backgrounds. And this is absolutely right. And I found myself a speaker in the Assembly, working all the time with an understanding that apart from the question of relationships, I had to understand that they had a different way of thinking about things. You'd negotiate an agenda for the meeting, you'd start following it through, you get item 1, 2, you'd come to item 3, and the nationalists would start saying, well, to understand item 3 and its significance, we've got to pick up some issues from item 5. And the unionists would say, there you are, you're not interested in peace, you're buggering around already. I mean, we take ages to negotiate an agenda, and we hardly started it before you want to disrupt the agenda. The nationalists say, no, we're really concerned to make it work. And we're persuaded that unless you introduce a number of these different things, in other words, don't simply think in a linear fashion, that it's impossible to actually address it. And a great deal of the work was in trying to find ways in which these different ways, historically different ways of thinking about things, are able to be brought together not in a dishonest way or in a way that covers up difference, but enables different forms of thinking to engage with each other in a fashion that benefits both. And you were describing how, David Trimble says the agreement is one that copper fastens the union, and Republicans were saying, well, it's a vehicle that trumps us to United Ireland. Actually, they didn't use those words. Those words were used of Sunningdale many years before, but they meant the same thing. And of course, both were right, depending on how the relationship was carried on. If the relationship between unionists and nationalists was a continuing positive engagement, Trimble might well have been right. But that isn't what happened. The British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference didn't meet for 10 years. And so, surprise, surprise, something happens that actually changes the whole posture. So this business of listening is really important, and it's important to dig into it and understand the complexity of it. And I think you've helped us a great deal in starting that off.
Bring up the work of Emile Bruno, who did work on perspective giving. There's this thing about perspective taking, which is oftentimes discussed in negotiations, interpersonal as well as larger negotiations, where you ask one side to take the perspective of the other side. And that seems to work pretty good when you have two parties of equal strength. But when you have asymmetric conflicts, what Emile found out was that actually asking the weaker side of the conflict to take the perspective of the stronger side actually backfired. It made, so asking Palestinians, for example, to take the perspective of the Israelis would just get them very angry. And it didn't really do much for the Israelis either. So, and I think part of the explanation for that is that the dominant side also has the dominant control of the media and the information. So both sides usually know what the dominant side actually thinks about things and their version of history and current events. Whereas when they ask the dominant side, like the Israelis, for example, to let the Palestinians give their perspective, and you just sit and listen. You don't give your perspective, essentially. The Palestinians can give their perspective. That not only did they find out the Israelis learned a lot that they didn't actually know before in terms of the Palestinians' worldview on things, but now the Palestinians actually found themselves to be very open now to, they found like across a variety of different measures that they were less defensive, they were more open to further conversation, they were willing to compromise on a variety of issues they weren't willing to compromise on before. So it seems like when it comes to asymmetric conflicts, perspective giving is really important, especially for the weaker side of an issue. And so I just kind of wanted to see if that's something that you guys have noticed in your work as well. And there was something else I wanted to say about perspective giving that's not quite. The fact that, so this is my observation of this in my field work. I would say that I think that while perspective giving, allowing the weaker side to give their perspective on things is powerful, because oftentimes when I'm interviewing jihadis or white nationalists or QAnon members, I have to realize I'm a representative of the dominant group when talking to these people. They see me as part of the Western elite or whatever. And I do see that when I listen to them, because that's my job, just to hear their perspective on things, that they do calm down, they open up, they're willing to even start psychoanalyzing themselves. What ends up happening is that I worry that it's a short-term effect. That ultimately, while they may drop their guards because now someone's listening to them, if that's not followed up by actual practical action, then I don't know how effective listening will be. Because after a while, it can kind of just become a technique of manipulation, right? Let the Palestinians express whatever they want to express. They'll calm down, they'll release, they'll have this cathartic thing. And then nothing will actually change. And then it'll build back up again after a while. And it just becomes a release valve. And I would assume that they would eventually, get savvy to this approach after a while and probably not even want to give their perspective as much anymore.
Okay, we're back to Graham and Padraig, and there's 3 or 4 issues there that they pick up, including this interesting question of how you feel it impacts on you.
Padraig, do you want to go first or shall I?
Yeah, I guess there were 2 occasions where interviewing had a profound effect on me. One was when I had been interviewing the families of the hunger strikers who died in 1981. And at the time I had cancer. So I used to fly from Boston. I did chemotherapy on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, flew to Northern Ireland on a Friday, threw up on the plane and worked until Monday and then flew back. But when I shared this with some of the families, they completely opened up and it transformed our whole relationship. Like any pulling back from what was really on their minds went away. And they cried about their losses and they blamed each other for not intervening. But the dynamic was completely different. And on 3 of these, I ended up on multiple occasions with the parents visiting the graves of the young men who died. And the lesson for me from my interaction with those families was that we hear a lot today about the IRA and the atrocities and the murders and the bombings and all of that, that most members of the IRA were essentially very young men from deprived backgrounds who had 1 or 2 bad run-ins with the police and who turned to the IRA for self-esteem, for meaning to their lives. But most of them didn't join because they had any ideological commitment to a united Ireland. And the other thing was that this would be the social entrapment involved. That once Bobby Sands died, and there were 9 other young men who died every 3 weeks thereafter, that once Bobby Sands died, any subsequent hunger striker who stopped because of family intervention would have invalidated Sands's death, or invalidated the death of all those who had died beforehand. So that all of these families lived in this very small, tight community. And you could not be the mother, because it was always the mother, you could not be the mother who stopped a hunger strike when the mothers of other hunger strikers had given the okay for their sons to die. And that lingered with me for years. Just the desperation, entrapment that comes when a cause is used to inflict great pain and suffering on so many people who have very little avenue and no support mechanisms to talk about what happened to them. So in a way, Chuck, I became like a bit of a therapist. And they just talked and wept and brought out all photos. It was the whole family album, and parents, grandparents. It had a profound impact on me. Thank you.
There are some similarities, not the same, some similarities, but in terms of how the interviewing process has had an impact on me, overwhelmingly, it was interviewing 15 families who lost loved ones in the Omagh bomb that physically had a significant effect on me. Stupidly, I had no experience of trauma counselling. And of course, when you go and interview someone in that situation in their house, they show you around the house, they show you to the room where their child lived, basically, and their belongings, which in many cases were still in place, and then take you through quite horrendous details on the day. It goes from that, including interviewing a person whose interview appeared in a book I did on the Omagh bomb, and then to be phoned about a month after that book came out by his wife to say he killed himself. And we had a long conversation about that. She said that he was so glad his story was out. He'd been looking to sort of end his own life for some time, even though he had a small child. And that still upsets me now, even thinking about that. To the other extreme, where you can discover in an interview that a senior Irish diplomat in the mid-80s gave Ronald Reagan his dog. Ronald Reagan had a liking of small dogs, and in the Irish embassy, Sean Donlon kept a small mongrel dog. And Reagan visited the embassy at one point and saw this dog and took a liking to him. And Donlon gave Reagan the dog, and he kept the dog at the White House for the rest of his time as president. Now, that more or less guaranteed an open door for Donlon and the Irish to the higher echelons of the Reagan administration. This stuff is not known. And it's that kind of almost incidental, small stuff, interpersonal stuff, which I think has a bigger impact than a lot of people realise. I would also say the interview process is an entirely mysterious one to me. That said, there are certain commonalities that exist over and over and over again. And John might know something about this, being a therapist, but the real golden nuggets of the interview, the stuff that you didn't know about, always seem to pop up between the 20 and 40-minute mark for me in the interview. It's almost as if the interviewee is spending the first 10 minutes sussing you out, so you never really ask anything big in that time. They're kind of, you're working each other out. Once they get to trust you, they reveal that stuff quite quickly, I find, but it tends to be in that slot. And it's almost, you could set your watch by it. It's so weird. I've done hundreds of interviews where that 20 to 40-minute mark is where the kind of the jewels of the interview are. It's a very, very peculiar process. But like Padraig, I've now come to the stage to go into interviews with no real questions in mind, except maybe one or two to get things underway, and then treat it as a conversation. And I learn a lot about that conversation. And there are certain things that people never really discuss, which is how close should you sit to an interviewee? What difference does it make where their contact for that interview is? If the person's at work, are they in work mode? If it's down the pub, are they more likely to be relaxed and tell you more? There are a whole range of different contexts which work very differently. One thing I am sure of, and I was talking to Padraig about this the other day, it's not good to interview somebody with someone else there. That does affect the flow because people then start to perform or feel they kind of have to construct and carry out this persona in front of the other person. But that interpersonal stuff, and John would know this, we saw this with the Oslo talks. Once people have spilled out their initial loathing positions and talk about their families, then the commonality starts to come in. And would you like a biscuit? Would you like a sandwich? Those very small details start to open up possibilities. It's the kind of humanization process. I don't think anything surprising about that. But I will say the interview process, what people will tell you, and this comes back to what Padraig was saying, what people have told me when the tape has been turned off is quite amazing. And people at the highest levels, formerly of government and others, what they want to get off their chest. And it's almost like that's the opportune moment. And that's happened to me time and time and time again. It's almost like they know they've seen me once, they're never going to see me again. But I would end on this point because Padraig is bang on about re-interviewing people when they feel they know you from the first time and what difference that makes. Robert Cairo, in his book on working, talks about the interviews he carried out for his enormous biographical studies of Lyndon Johnson. And he interviewed absolutely everybody he could get his hands on, from senior people in government to postmen to anybody that had any contact. And he interviewed Johnson's driver, and he interviewed him 5 times, and he refused to. He said, what was this guy like? He said, I can't tell you anything. He never used to speak to me. And he said, I couldn't believe this. So I kept re-interviewing him. And he kept saying, Johnson never spoke to me. I've got nothing to tell you. And on about the 6th time he got to him, he said, the reason he doesn't speak to me is because he's in the back rehearsing what he will say if things go wrong. And Cairo said, at that point, I understood the psychology, the fear of failure. And now that kind of then started to shape his understanding of the biography of this character. He had some idea of persona. And with Padraig, it's very important, if you can, for me to re-interview. And particularly after a period of time. I've interviewed John a number of occasions. And the stuff I found out you can never get from books. You just can't. It's that interpersonal stuff. It's very, very mysterious, the whole process. Why some people will open up in front of you and some people don't. I find a lot of people do open up. It's almost like they're waiting to get stuff off their chest. It's very, very, very strange. It's a responsibility as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed to both of you. If any of you have not read Padraig's book, Biting at the Grave, which is based on the interviews that he made over a period of years, and to quite a number of years before the families would even meet him and then open up to him. And as you can see, when they discovered the personal sacrifice and commitment and vulnerability of Padraig, he was no longer a person from the power dynamic. He was a person who had built a relationship and shown a commitment to them. Then the dynamic changed, and the book is a marvelous book to read. And as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, to read the book is an educational process in psychotherapy. It's a really marvelous book. Graham makes a number of really important points too, and he reminds me in his comment about how often in the later part of an interview, something will emerge. And this is well known amongst therapists, and it's well known amongst doctors generally, that very often it's in the later stage. In fact, when the person says, there's just one more thing I wanted to say, this is the only important thing that they're actually going to say.
I speak to you as someone who facilitates dialogue amongst larger groups, not as an interviewer as such, but I wanted to say first, there are a lot of similarities from what you're saying, sort of the informal private spaces, the non-directional approach of engaging with people, even though that takes time, as well as talking about sometimes your own experience as well. I could tell you a story about the time I went to Mike's place after the suicide bombing. A few days later, it was British Pakistanis who had done that. I rolled up in my UN Jeep as a British Pakistani and had a very long conversation with Mike, who'd come off the bar and who basically said to me, everyone's welcome, even though this was about 5-6 days later. In our own work, sometimes being a balancer, but also being counterintuitive very much helps. And somebody like me, you wouldn't see in a place like that doing the, I by the way, worked for Terry Larson, one of the architects of the Oslo peace process at the time. I was his special assistant. But I wanted to just ask you on one thing. You, of course, interview individuals or small groups. I wonder, what does one do with larger groups as such? Because the Oslo or our work on Israel-Palestine was very much focused on elites. We were always going to see Abu Mazen, Arafat, Abu Allah, whatever. And then, of course, Sharon, when he would see us, Shimon Peres and others. But that was pretty much a small group. My own work later on has said that actually you have to engage much more broadly and societally, especially if you're really going to have foundations for what you're doing. So my first, I know it's a longer question, but that first. And then secondly, I agree with the Zoom thing, but I have to tell you that over the last year and a half, we were able to keep a process going between the Syrian Democratic Council and communities in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and others virtually, which has then enabled us to be able to move forward now face to face. So there is a value in that. But if there's anyone listening, and I've been trying this for a long time, there is a challenge here, which is how do you make technology more empathetic? How do you make it more understanding? How do you create that environment? Because not everyone can make it to Geneva. Not everyone can make it to a particular process as such. Stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Salman. Graham, Padraig, do you want to respond to Salman's questions there?
You want to go first, Padraig?
Oh, you go.
On the technology front, I've no idea. I've absolutely no idea how that works. On the other question, because certainly in Northern Ireland, social media is causing more problems than one can imagine. And there's a lot of monologue, but no dialogue, a lot of noise, and it's dangerous. On the other point, I work with loyalists in Northern Ireland, and I've done for some time. Now that's very slow going. It's highly problematic because there are 3 organisations, not one. And those 3 organisations are very careful to defend their own interests and are very careful not to agree anything in front of the others for fear that it will backfire. That said, a moderate development, a moderate advance occurred in 2018 when myself and a handful of other people got the 3 organisations to agree a statement, a declaration of transformation statement, containing all kinds of comments about criminality, addressing criminality, the future, and all the rest of it. Now, the reason I was quite confident that was going to come off, because I spent a lot of time talking to them all one-to-one beforehand. So there was going to be no surprises. So I basically told them what the content would be. I told them where the consistencies were between that statement and what they'd said historically. So they could see it as a continuum, even though it was progress. And once they and I think I'd like to think part of it came down to trust in me in that. Once they were quite comfortable with that, and there was a certain degree of ambiguity involved as well, they pretty much quickly agreed it. And it's the perfect example of making progress with small groups. That said, things have gone backwards now because of Brexit. That's another story. So, but that's the only example I can draw up. Padraig's got many, I know, but it was doing a lot of work initially on the one-to-one. In other words, the informal became the structure and the basis for what was agreed formally.
All right.
Yeah, there's a different form of listening or non-listening going on in Northern Ireland at the moment. And there is increasing, I'll put the word conversation in quotes, going on about the prospects of a border poll and a united Ireland. And on the nationalist Republican side, if you're inside their bubble, you are almost easily convinced that all the criteria for a border poll have been met, that this would be an economic transformation that would be relatively economic painless, and that unity is around the corner. That's their bubble. The unionist bubble is that this is so far down the road, it's not even worth discussing. In fact, to discuss it in some way is to give it validity. Therefore, we can't engage in a conversation when that conversation is about an outcome that we think may not happen for decades. And then there's a third conversation in the Republic of Ireland, where polls show continually about 2/3 of the population favor unity. But when they're asked if they had to pay higher taxes to bring it about, it dissipates and becomes about 50%. And here, there's really no conversation at all. On the range of priorities for the Southern Republic, unity doesn't even figure, which does not mean that if Sinn Féin gets into government in 2025, which it will, that they will jumpstart some kind of process. But there is no, people talk about citizens' assemblies. This on the nationalist side, nationalists love citizens' assemblies. But there is no forum that seems capable of bringing divergent views on this matter into some kind of focus where some kind of consensus can be reached, where it is agreed that any unity poll may be 10 years away at least, rather than trying to track how it may happen every 3 months through polling. Loves the question. Every 3 months there's a question: do you want to unite Ireland or do you not? And these results are analysed in and out, up and down. So there's a continuous buzz about something, but there isn't any listening going on. These are all ideological positions, and it worries me. No one is listening.
Well, we've had the privilege of listening to the two of you, and indeed to the comments and thoughts from other colleagues. Certainly, I am very much stimulated by the comments that you've made, and I think there's a great deal more can be explored in this.